So when we think about costs, this is the moment when we be thinking about what is it going to cost me to produce the output. We've already learned about productivity, right? And the law of productivity. We now have to use that intuition to get us to costs. A reminder that in economics, costs always include economic cost or opportunity cost. So when we think of cost, we're always going to think in terms of alternate uses of our resources and what's the actual economic cost. Reminding ourselves that what the firm can do in terms of producing stuff is different in the short run and the long run, because in the short run, you can't really move from one industry to the other. You can't really leave and enter easily, right? You can't really change. Even if you're in the same industry and you decide that, okay, there's now labor has become cheaper, capital has become more expensive because of global warming, we are trying to raise the price of fuel. So all this fossil fuel industry, capital-based production is not going to work as well. And you want to move because capital is now more expensive, fuel is more expensive, you want to move to labor-based. It's still going to take you some time to do the shifts, even if you don't leave the industry and all you're doing is changing your production of technique. An example of this would be farmers who begin to realize that they want to move from commercial farming to, say, organic local farming, right? It still takes some time to make the move, to change the landscape and so on. So in the short run, your total cost is going to be the fixed cost plus the variable cost. Right? The fixed cost, because it is the short run, is the stuff that you have to pay whether you produce or not. So let us say that you took a rental for a storefront and the lease is for 6 months. You begin to find that because of COVID, suddenly your supplies are not coming in. You still have to pay the rent. Even if you're not producing or not able to sell, you still have to pay that rent. So that's a fixed cost. At the end of 6 months, when the lease is up, then you will no longer have to do it. So your long run in this case is 6 months when your fixed costs start disappearing and you can start ending your lease or moving to something else, right? So fixed costs are a particular amount that you just have to pay, regardless of what you're producing, whether you're producing. Usually it's your land or your capital, rental. So that's a fixed cost. Variable cost is the cost that you can change in the short run, depending on how much you produce. So even if I have a fixed cost of rental, I can have a variable cost based on how many workers I hire, right? So depending on how many workers I hire, which will change how much output I can get. So fixed costs plus variable costs. That's in the short run. In the long run, which we're going to come to after we finish the short run, since you can enter and exit, there will be no fixed cost. Everything will be variable cost. But we still have to figure out how the long run works, because certain types of decisions have to be made in the long run about entering and exiting industries, which are very different than what you have to do in the short run, where you're working with your existing capital and you're then adjusting your variable cost, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remind ourselves about the law of diminishing marginal productivity and how that S-shaped cost curve generated these bowl-shaped productivity curves, an average productivity curve with a marginal productivity curve that went up more steeply than the average at first, started coming down, average was still going up, hit the average at the top of the average, and then the marginal starts coming down sharper than the average. We're going to keep that in mind because it's going to affect how we think of costs. So while productivity was per input, cost is per unit output. So what we're doing is we're going to say the cost, fixed cost plus variable cost. The variable cost is going to be dependent on the price of the input, in this case, the wage, multiplied by how much input you used to produce that output. Right? So now we're starting from the output side and figuring out the cost. In the productivity graphs, I started on the input side and tried to figure out how much output can each input produce. I have to convert that information on a per output basis. So now what I'm saying is, okay, for one apple, using the information I had from my total productivity curve, how many workers would I have to hire? So let's remind ourselves of that S-shaped total productivity curve. This is going to be what will reflect our variable cost. Our fixed cost would be what I'm paying for the apple orchard. So the first thing I'm going to do, if I want to figure out what the cost is, I'm going to say no matter what quantity of apples I produce, I got to pay that. So even if I produce 0 apples, the costs now are in dollars. Even if I don't have any apples, this is my fixed cost. Now I want to produce 1 apple. So I'm going to read this graph in reverse. I'm going to say if I wanted 1 apple, how many workers would I need? If I wanted 2 apples, how many workers would I need? If I wanted 3 apples, how many workers would I need? If I wanted 4 apples, how many workers would I need? So I'm reading this graph in reverse. I'm adding in the question of input costs, and then I'm going to use it for my per unit cost. So just to remind ourselves, this is our total product curve based on productivity, the S-shaped curve I have, and I have to use this information to generate a cost curve. Okay. So let us start just with the variable cost. So what happens is, obviously when I don't have any apples, I'm not hiring anybody, I don't have any variable cost. Right? Then I ask myself, for the first apple, how many workers do I have to hire? So what I'm doing here is I'm coming here and saying, if I want 1 apple, how many workers do I need to hire? 1 worker, right? And 1 worker costs me $15 an hour, so the first apple cost me, in variable cost side, $15. I will have to add in the fixed cost to get the total cost. So let's say over here. The second apple, for the first apple I paid $15. In theory, if I had constant productivity, 1 apple, 1 worker, second apple would cost me 1 worker, that would be $15, and so I'd go to 30 and so on, and I'd get a straight line cost curve. So you're beginning to see, if I had a straight line productivity curve, I'd have a straight line cost curve, at least on the variable cost side. Right? But since I do not have that kind of productivity. I have this type of total productivity, which reflects the law of diminishing marginal productivity. What this means is, initially, my workers are actually got they've got marginal productivity, which is actually higher. The second worker is adding more apples than the first worker did. So that means for the second apple, I might not need to hire someone full time, right? Because it's the third apple that I need to hire 2 workers. So for the second apple, I might only need to hire 1.5 workers, right? So that means for the second apple, so I added 15. So maybe I hired somebody part-time and I only went to 25 as my variable cost for the second apple, right? Similarly, for the third apple, I'm still in this portion, right? It means that the amount of productivity that each worker is adding is still in increasing marginal productivity range. My cost is like this. But eventually, because of the law of diminishing marginal productivity, I'm going to get into this part of the curve. Which means eventually, when I go from 14 apples to 15 apples, it's going to take more and more and more workers to get that extra apple, all right? So the flip side of saying law of diminishing marginal productivity, where each extra worker doesn't add as much apples as before, is to say, to get an extra apple, I would need to add more workers. I wouldn't just be able to get away with adding the same amount of workers. I would need more workers. And that would mean my variable cost is starting to go up. So this shape of the law of diminishing marginal productivity gives a mirror image, which is flipped, where when this goes like that, that goes like that. And then when this becomes like this, becomes like that. So what I start to see is, as a result of the law of diminishing marginal productivity here, I'm going to get the law of increasing costs over here. Right? So if this is the shape of the cost curve, let us now remember this is only the variable cost. So what I'll do is I will need to essentially add my fixed cost. So let us say, even if it was 0, I still had to pay 25. That's my fixed cost. I'm going to add my fixed cost to my variable cost, and I'll get my total cost. So this variable cost, total cost, fixed cost, shape of the cost curve. Now, just as we did previously with revenue, where we tried to figure out average revenue and marginal revenue per unit of output, I now have the cost per unit of output. I need to figure out average cost and marginal cost. But now, finally, just as I figured out total revenue, I have now figured out how to calculate total cost. Profit will end up being maximum to maximize that distance between the total revenue and the total cost. So that's what we're going to have to do. So, but let's first use this information to figure out average cost and marginal cost.